All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Woods, and I'm going to be the moderator for this session for the big conference here today. This session is brought to you by our generous supporters, the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity, Humanity Forward Foundation, and Aid Kit and Steady. Thank you so much. Before we begin, please be aware the session is being recorded and will be available to view on Crowdcast after the conference. So please visit the conference website for more information and to find all of those sessions. Today, we are doing a great session on mental health. So it's called The Health and the Mental Health Case for Basic Income, Stories from the Front Lines and the Academy. So we've got two papers we're going to go over. We've got an amazing real-life story here, and we're going to dive in. So my name is Kimberly. As I said, I am with Income Movement. I'm the Volunteer Engagement Coordinator, and it is my pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm going to introduce our speakers. We have Sid Frankel on the end here. Sid is an associate professor at the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba, with research interests in poverty reduction, policy, including basic income, and the nonprofit sector. He's a board member of the Basic Income Canada Network and a founding board member of Basic Income Manitoba. Thank you so much for being here with us, Sid. Leslie Kausch is Futurocracy on Clubhouse. Leslie Kausch has been a North Carolina licensed clinical mental health counselor since 1994. For the first half of her career, she provided counseling and victim advocacy for crime victims, primarily in cases of domestic violence and sexual assault, through a homeless shelter, police department, courts, and nonprofit settings. As part of her work, she tried to help people navigate an inadequate and punitive means-tested system of public and private assistance. Currently, she is in private practice, specializing in helping adolescents and adults take a more proactive approach to their lives. Thank you so much for being here, Leslie.
It's my pleasure.
Faye Doney is also Futurocracy on Clubhouse. Faye is a small-town girl who becomes a grassroots activist for basic income. She spent 2.5 years traveling across the U.S. conducting personal research into helping people achieve goals and fulfillment in life. Proprietor of the Quest for Synecopia, speaker on Futurocracy, and founder of Garbage Art. I'm going to have to learn more about that. She is on a journey to help co-create the future we imagine together. So let's dive in. We've got, each of you are going to have a little bit of time to speak, and then we'll have some questions. I have got a couple prepared, and then we'll take some audience questions as well. So first off, Sarah, we have you on the schedule to go first.
Thank you. Yes. My name is Faye, and I wanted to tell you about some of the journey that I went through. But first, I want you to imagine walking into a women's shelter and hearing the sounds of women screaming at their children, at each other, the children screaming at each other, the smell of rotting flesh and mold that's growing on clothes. These environments are not safe havens to bring in people that really want to make change in their life. When I was traveling, I was living minimally off money out of my truck, and it wasn't always safe on the street, so I had to access certain resources along the way. Sometimes it was food stamps, women's shelter, etc. And so I got to experience what the mental health effects were. I saw trauma encoded in little kids' brains while I was in that women's shelter. And the lasting effects of that is really hard. And it took about a year after being back in stable living for the brain fog to remove from my life. And not just that, it took patience from the employers that I had because I was having mental health effects of coming back into normal living. Panic attacks, anxiety attacks. And it took people who loved me and cared about me to help me readjust. They say use it or lose it with your brain because that space is taken up with whatever you're focusing on. And if all you care about is your safety and security, then what happens is You forget how to budget. You forget how to spend money. You forget how to do these things. When I was in that woman's shelter, I had to get a special permission slip to be outside of the shelter past 6 p.m., but I went to a Yang Gang bonfire. And where I was is just all these basic income advocates, and there was a person there inspired by Andrew Yang's Freedom Dividend who gave me 3 installments of $1,000 out of their own pocket. And that allowed me to finally breathe for the first time in a long time. And following that, I actually flew out to Iowa to help advocate for basic income because I got to experience what it's like. But with that money, before I left, I was able to give some of that to a woman who was about to throw away all her stuff because the wheel on her cart had broken. Another woman needed money to pay for gas to go to an interview. 2 elderly ladies needed to get their car out of the shop, but there was a $200 deductible. People who receive this money, I've talked to many across the country while I traveled. A lot of them wanted to use it on dental or to go see the doctor or help someone they love and care about who's struggling. So they say you are up to 2 to 13.7 times more likely to be re-victimized if you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. And when you are in poverty, you experience that all day, every day, and it doesn't get better, okay? It doesn't magically resolve itself, and it's expensive to be poor. There's discrimination against poor people. You can't go to the bathroom unless you're a customer, okay? And they will reject you. And I've watched many people go behind buildings of those places and not put it in to the toilet, okay? And these systems are designed in order to make sure we have health, okay? But if you're making sure that people can't use your facilities, when the pandemic hit, libraries closed down where people could charge their phones, where they could have safety from the heat or the cold. Showers became harder to have, okay? It's hard to get sleep when you're sleeping in your vehicle, when a security officer or actual police officers knock on your window. And if you're living in a tent, ants will eat you. And again, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, right? And we don't think about the systems that we do have in place and how they might actually give us trauma as well. When I lived in apartment living, there was a point I starved myself because I couldn't afford food, because rent was just too high. I went to go get food stamps, and I got about $12 a month because my partner made just enough. I had already lost a lot of weight. I had made poor decisions after that in order to make sure I could eat, which led to PTSD. Thank you. The journey of poverty is hard. And when I did some of my work, I got the opportunity to see behind the scenes in people's homes where they're fighting or there's mold or there's other things. I got to see it with my own 2 eyes. And, money is safety. Money allows us to buy safety. But we live in a world full of generational trauma, racial trauma, situational trauma, too much trauma. And when we have too much trauma, we can't think straight. Our attention spans are smaller. We can't use executive functioning as well, and hope to God you don't have any other mental health issues that make it harder, like ADHD or PTSD. We don't know what enough is either. We don't know what enough safety is. We don't know what inevitable human needs are, what the proper care and feeding of humans are. There is a baseline, and being alive is not free. You can try. I tried. It's not. I recently had to look back into my childhood to understand my psychology around money. When I was a kid, there was a family member I loved and cared about who paid me money in order for me to overlook their indiscretions. I attached a confusion around love and money and safety. I was rewarded for someone else's inappropriate behavior. And as a kid, I didn't know better. But now as an adult, I see money as unsafe. That's not okay. I had to wake up to that, but it took time, it took therapy, it took energy to even recognize the source of this. And cognitive dissonance is two competing belief systems. And if you think money is unsafe, yet money is what brings safety, it might lead to aversion or overcompensation because we don't know what enough is. I think that the people I've met along my journey, whether they were nonprofit owners or people who wanted to speak up, mothers with cancer, or friends that were sleeping out of their vehicles. There's a lot of people doing good, hard work right now in our country, grassroots advocates that can't meet their own needs. And we don't pay them. But they see that investing in the future is worth it because they might have a kid or a sibling or someone else they care about that they know can't take care of their needs unless we get basic income. It is a breath of fresh air to be able to have money and to plan for your future and not till the next month's rent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faye, for your testimonial. Leslie.
So Faye talked about her lived experience. I'm going to talk more from the clinical end. But first I want to mention briefly how I came to back a basic income. It was mostly to get my son to quit bugging me. He kept sending me videos about basic income, but he sent me a lot of videos, but he just was on and on. Okay. So finally, to get him to stop, I watched the video about basic income, and it jogged my mind to some years prior when I was in graduate school. I ran across a very short blurb, literally a paragraph or two, in the back of a counseling journal talking about a longitudinal study of adolescent mental health in some rural poor counties in western North Carolina. This was the Great Smoky Mountain Study. And strictly by chance, in the middle of the study, the Cherokee were given the rights to build and operate casinos in their area. So all of a sudden, in the middle of this study, a quarter of the kids were no longer poor. That's the only thing that changed. Parents didn't spend more time with their kids. They weren't nicer to their kids. The only thing that changed is for 25% of the kids, they weren't poor. So in real time, researchers got to watch mental symptoms of mental illness fall off a cliff like that. And I'm looking at this little blurb in the back of a journal. You know, I reread it. So they just proved that alleviating poverty cures a lot of mental illness, you know, or poverty causes mental illness. So I'm asking my colleagues and professors, like, so why is this not like front page and now driving policy? And they just sort of looked at me weird and patted me on the head. So I just dropped it. But then I'm watching this video and I was like, that was a basic income. They got predictable, regular cash with no strings attached, just 'cause. So now I had a word for it, I knew what to advocate for, and I had a community to do it with. So that's how I came to thinking about this in the first place. This morning I want to share a couple of client stories. The first is Myra. Myra was married with several children and was referred to me by her doctor for help with her anxiety disorder. As I worked to understand sort of the context or the situations that most often triggered her anxiety, it became really clear to me that she was scared of her husband. They had moved to North Carolina shortly after she was married, so she didn't have any family nearby, and he made it really hard for her to make friends. Anytime she wasn't with him, he would call and text repeatedly, and if she didn't pick up right away, he would just show up wherever she was. He blamed her for everything and berated her and called her names, even in front of the kids. He never hit her. Should I hold it closer? Okay. He never hit her, but he had broken household items near her. And sometimes when he was really mad, he would clean his gun in the family room. With the kids, he would scream at them for hours and berate them and follow them while they did their chores, just berating them. To her knowledge, he had never hit the kids, but they were terrified of him, and they avoided him whenever they could. She had tried to leave once, taking the kids to her parents' house out of town, but it was really short-lived. He threatened to call the police and report the car stolen. He said that he had contacted a lawyer, and the lawyer said he could get full custody because she had taken the kids out of state. He threatened to kill her and her parents and just take the kids. He threatened to kill himself if she didn't return. She was terrified to go back, but she wasn't willing to risk losing the kids or putting the rest of her family in danger. So she went home and she stayed. It will not surprise anyone here that, clinically speaking, she did not have an anxiety disorder. She had understandable and legitimate anxiety from living in a scary and dangerous situation. I worked with her on strategies to keep her a little safer and to improve her and the kids' mental health as much as I could. We were able to pull off some stuff, but it was limited. She came to one appointment after a particularly explosive incident, and she said, "That's it, I want to leave." So I told her I would help how I could. As we started planning how she could leave safely, I realized she had zero access to the family money. She had no access to information about the family money. She had no access to any information about any of their assets, none of it. Their house and their cars were in the name of his family's business. She hadn't signed or seen taxes in years, so she had no idea what their financial situation was. He made her use her mostly maxed out credit cards to buy groceries and household things, and then every month he would pay them down just enough so she could almost make the next month's groceries and household items. She started to get a little cash back from the grocery store and stashed it in a savings account in a different bank, but we're pretty sure he figured out what was going on because he started paying less on her credit card each month until she had fully run down her reserves at the other bank. Over the years, she sometimes worked at the family business, but her pay was direct deposited into the family account, which she could not access. He refused to pay for childcare, saying she was the one who was supposed to do the childcare, and he wouldn't help with the kids when she wasn't there. So she would often have to leave work to take them to appointments or if they were sick and that kind of thing. And he got her fired from 2 jobs by showing up and making a scene while she was working. Almost all of their account information was password protected on his computer, which she couldn't access. And there were some paper files, but they were in a safe that alerted him by text if anybody accessed it. Not that she had the code anyway, but still. He usually checked the mail, but one day she checked the mail and saw there was something from what looked like an investment firm. He was right in the house when she came in, and he took the mail and opened it in front of her and sort of flipped through it quickly and said, "Oh, this is just a statement of how much debt we have." And he ripped it into several pieces and threw it into the kitchen trash. But then he went and got cooking oil and then threw the coffee grounds on top of that before taking the whole bag and putting it in the back of his car. So literally, she had no idea of what they were up against or what their financial situation was. deciding to leave is a really personal decision, and it can also be exceedingly dangerous. So I never make this decision for anyone else, even if they ask me directly what they should do. That is not something I'm willing to do or it makes sense to do. But in Myra's case, she's the only person I ever had to say, I don't see any way you can leave. She had nowhere to go. She had no way to support her and the kids. I mean, even if she left the kids, which she did not want to do, and they didn't want her to do, she couldn't support herself while through the months of legal haranguing to get alimony or child support. Never mind, where's she going to get a lawyer that's willing to not take a retainer, and I'm sure you'll be good for it later. It wasn't going to happen. So I want to share this slide just for a little context about domestic violence. I know it may be hard for you to read, but this is just a model of the tactics that some people use to manipulate and control their partners. There's one section that's economic abuse, and so that's only one piece of the puzzle, but Myra's husband checked all those boxes. But the thing about the economic abuse piece is that if you solve that one piece of the puzzle, that practical aspect makes it easier to minimize or manage those other aspects. If Myra had access to money that was hers, that was regular and predictable, it would have made all the difference. Now, no lie, she would not have been able to access it probably while she was in the home. She wouldn't have. But part of the safety plan would have been arranging to have that money direct deposited into her own account at a different bank, so as soon as she left, she would start having those regular payments. Any basic income would not have solved all of Myra's problems, not by a long shot, and it would not have made any of it easy, but it would have given her choices, and it would have made it so much easier for her to manage the rest of that. So now let's talk about Tiffany. Tiffany was a single mom whose child, Quentin, was referred by his classroom teacher because of his behavior. He was alternately disruptive or distracted. He struggled to make friends, and if he got called out or made a mistake, he was inconsolable. When I met Tiffany, she and Quentin had just moved in with her disabled mom, her cousin's boyfriend, and their 3 children, and they were living in a small 2-bedroom apartment. Tiffany slept on the couch, and Quentin slept with his grandma while her cousin and her family lived in the other bedroom. Between them, the adults were able to afford the rent and the utilities, and Tiffany's mom was generally available to provide childcare. But Tiffany's mom had pretty significant mobility issues, and she often had doctor's appointments or she was too ill to take care of the children. As small as the apartment was, the kids could not play outside. Gunfire was heard frequently in the neighborhood, and the week before I had met them, someone was killed on their block. Like, they came in and saw the body. So mostly the kids watched TV and played on their devices at home. The oldest child in the home, an 8-year-old girl, made a comment that sounded like she sometimes was the one who provided childcare when all the adults couldn't be in the home. In North Carolina, our public transportation is sketchy. It's just irregular and it's not very reliable. Tiffany's sister, who didn't live in the home, and her cousin's boyfriend both had cars, but they couldn't always be available to take Tiffany to work or to the store. And sometimes they wanted money for their trouble or for gas. And so transportation was tricky to figure out. Life was complicated for Tiffany and Quentin, and it was sometimes chaotic. Tiffany was great. She was a loving mom, and she did everything she could for Quentin, especially, but everything was limited. Space, time, money, and peace. Under our contract with Medicaid, I was expected to provide counseling and resilience training to Quentin and parenting skills and resources to Tiffany. I was able to provide some support, and Tiffany was eager and willing for anything I brought to the table, but it was hard to talk for more than a few minutes just because there was always a lot going on there. A more basic problem was that the practical resources I had to offer were temporary or hard to access or both. Like I could get her bus passes or clothing vouchers, but that was a one-off thing. Or I could get her enrichment activities for Quentin or some financial assistance, but either transportation was a big issue or the documentation to apply and track things was a pain in the rear. So it just wasn't practical. I talked to my director about this, and he said my job was to provide resources to our parents every week. Whether they could access them or not was not an issue. We just had to be able to show that we had provided these resources. So really, neither my agency nor Medicaid really cared whether the resources we offered were useful. They just wanted to be able to show we offered them. Then, if clients failed to show improvement, but hadn't accessed the resources that were not accessible, we could code that as them being non-compliant for not making use of the resources we had offered them. Also, there's that issue of safety that I mentioned before. Like, I was pretty sure an 8-year-old was a regular babysitter for her cousins and for her siblings and her cousins. And this is this terrible gray area for frontline workers. If I had clear evidence that an 8-year-old is babysitting, I have to report that to Child Protective Services. That is a safety issue. And they would investigate and likely would work with the adults to set up something different, but they're not actually going to offer resources to help, just consequences if they don't. Or CPS could take the kids into custody, which would add this whole other layer of expense and complexity to their already complex lives. Now, they would have to organize their schedules and their transportation around CPS's schedules of classes and visitations with the kids. And there are big penalties if you miss or are late for those. Because then the thinking becomes, well, if you can't show up for these classes and visitations so that we can assure that you are safely parenting your child, well, we obviously can't believe that you could safely actually parent your child. And it just becomes this terrible cycle. So to prevent this, I did have access to some childcare vouchers, but the parents had to have predictable regular hours, which Tiffany did not have because of her work. And she didn't qualify for long-term assistance in that way because their household income was too high because there were 3 working adults and mom got some disability. I didn't end up calling CPS. I talked to my boss about it, and he said, look, we don't have verifiable evidence that this is going on, and the risk of harm is frankly higher if we report, so don't ask questions about it, and just help how you can. Okay. I asked around with some colleagues, and I thought I had a bead on an apartment that Tiffany could afford herself so she could have a bedroom. She was so excited about having her own bedroom, even if she shared it with Quentin. But that was great until we started talking logistics. So first of all, if she moved into her own apartment, it was going to be harder for her to help take care of her mom. Her mom didn't quite qualify for long-term care, and Tiffany and her sister didn't really want her in a home anyway. But her mom couldn't really take care of herself, especially when she had a flare-up, so that made Tiffany her primary caregiver. The other thing is Quentin would have had to change schools, and it had already taken some time to build up some resource and support for him at that school. And the third thing is childcare would be harder to access. There wouldn't be other adults living in the house, and she didn't know anybody in the new neighborhood. From the perspective of Medicaid and my agency, Quentin and Tiffany had mental health and maturity issues. And the thinking was if we could just provide them with skills to better manage their money, their emotions, and their time, their lives would get better. It's simple. But the fact is, Tiffany didn't struggle with any of those things. She was so resourceful. She was amazing at like scrapping and putting together the things that she needed with a resilience that I would really struggle to match. And yes, she sometimes got pissy, and sometimes she got overwhelmed, and sometimes she cried. This is not pathology. This is a normal human reaction to being alive, especially if you are alive in a precarious situation. In the end, I visited and helped as much as I could. We maxed out her authorization. But I wasn't able to help that much. Somewhere down the road, psychological support would be awesome for them, but what they really needed was actual help. They needed money. All of them were caught in this generational cycle of poverty, and it was exceedingly unlikely that Tiffany was going to get out by herself without her family also getting out of that cycle. As with Myra, a basic income would not have solved all of Tiffany's problems, but it would have made many of them much easier to solve. As much as half of what we code as mental illness can better be explained by poverty. And the same is true of homelessness and addiction and chronic illness, and the list goes on. We could end a lot of human suffering with a basic income. But there's another strong argument that I especially use with some of my friends on the right. As my son will tell you, I'm really cheap. Multiple pilot projects and even the National Institute's statistics show that we would likely save minimally $1 billion a year in the US if we implemented a basic income, because we would lower our costs of the court system, of the healthcare system, of the mental health system, of any number of projects, patchworks that count for us as a safety net. None of the difficulties I've talked about will cease to exist when we have a basic income. There will still be mental illness, there will still be addiction, there will still be deaths of despair, but all of these have consistently been shown to dramatically decrease with a basic income. The humane answer to human suffering is a basic income, but it turns out it's also a fiscally sensible one as well. Thank you.
So much, Leslie. That was very, very enlightening. A lot of tidbits. We definitely hold your questions. We're going to get to Sid, and then we will. I have a couple banked here, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay. Well, first, let me say I feel privileged to be on a panel that shares knowledge and evidence from lived experience from several different positionalities, and knowledge and evidence from research. And in this case, I'm sure you'll agree that they both come together. So I'm going to try to do a few things quickly. I'm going to put basic income in the context of the social developments, the social determinants, rather, of health. This shows us the pathways through which basic income can have an effect, and how it interacts with other factors, as both Faye and Leslie have just explained. I'm going to go on to present a few examples of the evidence from basic income research on health effects. I'm going to talk a bit about the effects of basic income on education, which in turn is a determinant of health. Finally, I'm going to end up where Leslie was by talking about some of the objections that people raise, people who say this evidence about effects on mental and physical health really isn't a good enough rationale to institute a basic income. Next slide, please. So here you have one of a number of possible diagrams of the social determinants of health, and these pathways and these factors have been well supported in research for really around 5 decades now. So I'm directionally challenged. So the structural determinants, are they on your right or left? I think on your right? On the left. On the left? Okay. So you'll see one of those structural determinants is public policy, and that's the realm we're working in. We're arguing for a change in income support policy to basic income. We can see how, in turn, that public policy change can affect socioeconomic factors, including income, but also education. In turn, this interacts with, it determines the material circumstances of people, their housing and their general life circumstances. We've heard vivid examples of how income interacts with psychological factors and behavioral factors. It also interacts with biological factors. And at the end, we have a health gradient, so that there is an inverse relationship between income and health status. Next slide, please. So here is one piece of evidence often cited by my wonderful colleague, Evelyn Forget, an economist who started out to be a psychologist, an economist who grew up in poverty. So in the MINCOME research in Manitoba, which lasted from 1974 to 79 and was canceled, there was a Dauphin saturation site where everyone in Dauphin who met the income qualification was eligible to receive a basic income. But this basic income was not very generous. It was only 60% of the low-income cutoffs, one of the poverty lines in Canada. So the basic income didn't get people with no income even to poverty, and it had a reasonably progressive tax back rate of 50%. Next slide, please. Evelyn developed an interrupted time series design. It's not as strong as a randomized experiment, but it's one of the strongest quasi-experimental designs, and we can be quite certain of causal effects. That involved her developing controls, and she was able to use our provincial health registry to develop controls. And it was based on a strong method called propensity score matching. So propensity factors are those factors which select people or selected people in Dauphin into receiving a basic income. They included age, gender, family size, settlement size, and family structure. So Evelyn and we can be reasonably sure that the comparison group contains people quite similar to people who received a basic income. Next slide, please. What were the findings? In Manitoba, we don't count people going into hospital, we count people leaving hospitals. So these hospital separations fell by 8.5%. That's significant, and as Leslie has told you, that's big dollars. The decline was statistically significant at the 1% level. It's very unlikely it would have occurred by chance alone, and it was made up mostly of decreases in accidents and injuries and mental health diagnoses. And it persisted for 6 years after the end of the basic income, and then it disappeared. So we can be reasonably sure it had something to do with the basic income. If it quacks and if it has a bill and if it has webbed feet, it's probably a duck. There's some chance it might be a platypus, but it's unlikely. Okay, another experiment, this one in India, just to look at the various different terrains that we have found these effects. 8 randomly assigned saturation villages where everyone was eligible, and 8 randomly assigned control villages. The intervention was a monthly demogrant for 12 months. It lasted only 12 months, and the benefit was only 30% of the poverty line in India. So in both these cases, people were not brought up to the poverty line. Next slide, please. We found self-reports of decreases of episodes of illness, at least 24 hours, requiring non-hospital care. Intervention households, 52%. Control households, 64%. So we have a significant effect here, and the findings tell us why. The experimental households did not spend their money frivolously. They spent it on medicines, doctor fees, and hospitalizations. And India has a public health system, but it's an extremely inadequate one. So that's why this spending occurs. Next slide, please. The Ontario Basic Income Pilot, which lasted for some people a little over a year, for many people less than a year, 2017, 2018. So we have, oh, I just lost my screen. I think I have to plug in. Bear with me. Now, if I only have my cord. Yes. It's taking its time. There we are. Maybe you can edit that out. Just let me take a minute, or let it take a minute. Sorry, I thought I had lots of juice. I wish I had said that. Okay, I'm back. Before fate interrupted us, we were talking about the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. So it served 4,000 low-income Ontarians in 3 sites, and one was a saturation site. The benefit was quite generous. So for singles, it was almost 17,000 Canadian dollars. For couples, it was a little bit over 24,000, an extra $500 per month for people with disabilities. And the tax-back rate, again, was quite generous, 50%. So here, next slide, please. So here you see some evidence, and you see it because of Kimberly's help in improving the slides. You see some evidence from a survey of 217 of the recipients from the city of Hamilton and the surrounding rural area. And remember, again, the short duration of this trial. So here we see their report on the survey, and I'm not going to go over all of it, but we see that almost 80% reported somewhat or much better health. And this is mostly physical health. Part of it may have to do with going to the doctor more often, but that was only 14.8%. A lot of it might have to do with having a new capacity for physical activity, almost 74%. Next slide, please. Okay, some more physical health data. 74% of people found it easier to see a dentist, and dentistry is not part of our publicly provided health in Canada. Thinking about the mental health effects, around half of the people found it much easier to seek therapeutic services. Looking at some other issues, for almost 70%, there was improvement in the health of children of the recipients. And we know that health in childhood is a very strong predictor of health throughout the life cycle, so this is important. Do people use a basic income to serve their addictions? Apparently not. Some of them, based on the conversation we heard in a panel yesterday, might be involved in pleasure activities. But in this survey, around 23% use tobacco less often. 10% completely quit use in the pilot, and only around 3% use tobacco more. Looking at alcohol, almost 31% used it less. A little over 3% completely quit using alcohol. Only about 4.8% used it more. So here we don't have evidence of the arguments sometimes used that a basic income will lead to far more use of substances and in the end, far more addiction. Next slide, please. Okay, looking a bit at the mental health effects. So over 82%, almost 83% of people reported improvements in their overall mental health. Look at something Faye talked about, the improvements in outlook. Over 86% reported a much more positive outlook. So we have some hard evidence of people who had an experience with a basic income, but remember, not a very long experience with the basic income, and then a big disappointment when the new premier canceled the basic income, despite his clear promises in the election not to do so. So we're probably also seeing some blunting of the effects of basic income based on that disappointment. Next slide, please. There's evidence from health effects of interventions similar to a basic income, and I'm reporting here from a recently reported scoping review of 27 studies of 9 interventions in middle-income and high-income countries. These authors thought that the 4 characteristics of a basic income were universality, permanence, unconditionality, and the fact that the basic income is not affected by other income. Some of us may disagree with that definition, but nevertheless, they're reporting on studies here of programs that met some, but not all of these criteria. Next slide, please. So they found, just briefly, that health effects did vary by health outcome. There were strong positive effects on birth weight, which you know is a determinant of health throughout the life cycle, adult and child mental health, infant obesity, and service use and nutrition. And the mechanisms that were found most important here: reduced financial strain, reduced stress, and improved parenting. We have evidence from other research that there is a link between reducing financial strain, improving parents' mental health, and then instituting more positive parenting and less negative parenting, and then improvements in child mental health. So this is supported by much other research. Next slide, please. We have some indirect evidence, and Leslie mentioned one of the studies reported in this review. So this is a systematic review of 13 panel studies and longitudinal studies. These are studies of changes of the effects of changes of income on self-reported health. 10 of the 13 studies found a statistically significant but small positive effect. This study didn't account for measurement error, and many of the studies had very small samples, so there was little statistical power to find differences So we probably have an underestimate of the size of the effects here. Next slide, please. Just looking briefly at educational effects, and you'll remember from the determinants, the social determinants of health diagram, that education as well as income is a determinant of health. And Evelyn Forget and Dauphin did find some educational effects. She compared Dauphin with aggregate data from other similar communities and for the rest of the province of Manitoba. So during the experiment, grade 11 students were more likely to continue to grade 12 than any of the urban or rural counterparts, Before and after the experiment, grade 11 students were less likely than urban counterparts and as likely as rural counterparts to continue to grade 12. And unfortunately, these effects didn't last very long after the experiment, which is very bad for those young people at the time, but does provide stronger evidence of the connection of the experiment to the educational effects. Next slide, please. What might the naysayers say? And I've heard some of this. Well, the first thing they'll say is the research has methodological flaws. There's construct validity problems. People may be reacting to the short-term nature of the studies. There's external validity problems. Most of the studies cannot recruit representative samples, and if they do, there's differential, what researchers use the charming term of differential mortality. That doesn't mean people die, it means they leave the experiment. People at lower income are more likely to leave the experiment, so the samples are not representative. There's internal validity problems. Most of the studies that I've talked about do not meet the gold standard of a randomized experiment. So the naysayers may say this. Next slide, please. Well, what can we tell them? Well, first of all, we can remind them that all research has limitations, including the gold standard, including randomized clinical trials. And we should make the case for a balance in looking not only at the weaknesses of the research, but at the strengths of the research. This is kind of a baby and bathwater argument. Why should we throw out the baby of the evidence with the bathwater? We also could point out that there's differential treatment of basic income. Most income support approaches were implemented without any research. Why do we object when basic income doesn't have enough pristine findings? Let's have a level playing field here. Well, what about the alternatives? For example, we have a lot of evidence that social assistance, usually called welfare, actually has harmful effects on people's mental health and physical health. For example, there's a lot of evidence that welfare receipt is highly stigmatized, and that stigma has real health effects. Next slide, please. Another objection, the kind of, well, this is all very good, but, and the two big buts, we can't afford it. And the other big but, it'll lead to a disaster for the economy because people will quit work or they'll work less. Next slide, please. Well, as Leslie has made the case, we can point out that improvements in health status have an economic value, certainly savings in health care, savings in some of the other areas Leslie talked about, and we have evidence that a basic income improves health, and improved health can lead, often does lead, to increased capacity for work and the increased capacity to pay taxes. What might more of the responses be? Next slide, please. Great, you're great, Kimberly. We can't, those of us who advocate for a basic income, can't afford to let others who don't develop the cost estimates. So we have to take charge of developing cost estimates for basic income schemes, and then we can put them out in the arena of public debate so that there is an alternative to what the detractors say. Well, on the labor supply effects, this is kind of a zombie. It's killed over and over again by evidence, but it keeps rising from the grave. The evidence is very clear that labor supply effects are low to moderate, first of all. Nowhere near 20% even of people quit or decrease work. And the reasons people are leaving are also reasons which are probably good for the economy. And you've heard some of this before, more time with young children. And we have very sound evidence that when parents spend more time with young children, that really supports and improves child development. And more career laddering through job search. Mostly this applied in the early research mostly to men. In the later research, women are included. This had to do with people not just thinking about the next survival job, but thinking about careers. And this gave people an opportunity to take a career perspective and to look for jobs that would serve that career perspective and not choose Mick jobs. Hope no one was planning on McDonald's for lunch, but thank you all.
Thank you so much, Sid, for all of that data. It really is interesting to see it laying out with the experiments that you cited. Really brought in the things that Leslie and Faye were talking about into focus. I have a couple of questions prepared, but if you guys have any, please, we will get to them very shortly. One question that I think is really important to talk about is, how are currently available income support programs and public services not meeting needs?
I feel like I can answer this one.
Sorry. We're going to do a shuffle.
For me, I feel like there's a lot of needs that aren't being met because there are people who apply and it might take them like 2 years to get disability. It might take them a long time to get it. There's fear of repercussions. If somehow you did better in your life, you might have to give up what you've already achieved. And it's like you can't just keep adding to it. They take it away and it actually puts you farther back behind. I mentioned the food stamps and how that affected me. And I've tried to reapply for food stamps no joke, 10 times since then, but I have PTSD around trying to get food stamps. So it actually inhibits me from trying to get help because of just the psychological effects of what we have. There's not enough resources available to people in women's shelters, for example. They have to carry their stuff with them if that facility is used for other services. And some of these people are disabled. Some of these people are old or young with mental health problems. I saw a woman screaming at the wall, okay? So she struggles to take care of her needs, but they don't have lockers available or storage units available for you to leave your stuff. And if it rains, it's just gets heavier throughout the day. Free cell phones that exist sounds like a great idea. They run slow, they die quickly, they don't have very much data available to you, and I've seen multiple people throw those phones out of anger. So it's maybe quality matters if you want to help people, okay? And when you are in a women's shelter, they take your phones away anyway, and so you can't even try to look for jobs when you have a place over your head. And so there's a lot of limitations, and libraries are a great resource for homeless people, but if we have a global pandemic and they all shut down, you have eliminated access to these resources. Some people would use gym memberships to have showers. Guess what? Those also closed down. And so, like, if you're in an area where you don't know anyone, or maybe you've burned bridges because you got mental health problems, you know, if you can't lean on additional people, you're struggling, you're lonely, and it just is overwhelming. And, you know, there's a lot of coping mechanisms that occur because we can't meet our needs. And we're just trying to cope, you know, and there shouldn't be this stigma to that either. You know, once I got back into stable living, I was able to be clean from alcohol for 1.5 years, okay? A little more than that now. But because I had stability back in my life. So we can't just assume people are going to make terrible decisions once they get a leg up. And, you know, we need a reevaluation of what that baseline is, and if we can even raise the bar on what's acceptable, you know. But I would love to see our politicians spend 1 week in a shelter, okay? Like, they would know all the problems instantly.
1 hour, please.
You know, and some of these things, like, they test you for TB, so, like, if you were afraid of needles and stuff, like, they take your blood and just to get into a shelter, you know, and permission slips to stay out past a certain curfew. You know, if you don't come back that day, you lose your bed, okay? So there's a whole lot of pressure on these things, and hopefully, you know, you feel safe there. There was a woman who had a baby. She was high up in a gang, and she left the gang so she could raise her baby. But that women's shelter environment I was in was not a safe haven that would produce an environment where she wouldn't go back to the easier solution. Yeah. So we need to consider what that means.
Yeah. Leslie, do you have any thoughts around that?
Can you ask the question?
Yeah. So how are currently available income support programs and public services not meeting needs? I think you covered a little bit of this, but if you can pinpoint one or two that are high on the list.
Well, actually, I think of it broader than that. I mean, once you start getting assistance, it is built so that you cannot cross the gap to being self-sufficient. It's organized that way. Once you get assistance, if you make any gains, you lose it's like trying to jump, but you're like standing on a piece of like soft fabric. So when you jump this way, you actually get no traction. You just move the fabric backwards. It's how it's designed. It's not a bug. It's how it's designed.
Yeah.
My colleagues have covered this wonderfully. I'll just mention two things. Social insurances are great, but they depend upon consistent labor market attachment, and so they just don't cover the whole population. So that's why the universality of basic income in a nutshell is important. Secondly, in many countries, Canada and at least temporarily in the US, there are partial basic incomes that have shown very important benefits. So there are, in Canada, the Canada Child Benefit, and you briefly during the pandemic, I've forgotten what your benefit was called, had
Child
something.
tax credit.
Child
Tax
credit. These are really partial basic incomes for families with children, and for advocates, it's a good thing they exist because they can be used to argue for a basic income. And in Canada, we do have a Demogrant old age security, which goes to every Canadian at the age of 65 and is taxed back from Canadians who have higher incomes. So I receive it and pay it all back. So that is a kind of basic income.
Yeah.
So it exists.
Excellent. I have one other question around kind of who's responsible. So why is it the government's job to improve health and mental health through providing a basic income? Why do we think that it's their responsibility?
Can I go first?
Yes.
No, I'm irritated. irritated. I forgot about this question. It irritated me when I read it too. So what is the point of a government if it's not to organize for the well-being of the constituents? And even if you just want to be crass about it and take it from Danielle's cheap mom's perspective, like we would save cash upon cash, never mind the cost of the human suffering, and that is built into the system. I don't understand any argument that it's not the government's responsibility.
I think this is a kind of false binary. It's both the government's responsibility and individuals' responsibility. Or to put it differently, all of us have a responsibility to organize our finances as best we can and make the best decisions we can. But in modern post-industrial society, there are risks that are completely beyond our control. You and I don't control the unemployment rate, for example. You and I don't control industries moving out of single industry towns, and that's why we organize governments that can take a macroeconomic perspective and work in combination with individuals to make sure that we all have a basic level of security. So when this question is asked, I think it's based on a false kind of dichotomy, and I think we should tell people that there's something wrong with the way they're thinking about this issue.
Make a very good point. Faye, do you have anything to add to that?
Mine's related, but not directly. I think we should approach this from as many possible angles that we can. The government is one way, but I mean, we also should consider making sure that the largest employers of a city should pay a livable wage so that the resources that are for those who need it in emergencies, they aren't overtaxed, because that's what's happening. Everyone's leaning on these services and they're burning out, they're running out of energy and money. So as many angles as we can get this, that's my own opinion.
Yeah, very good point as well. Are there any audience questions? We don't have a lot of time left, but if there's anyone who has a question that they have a burning desire to ask, please step to the mic and share with us. And please share your name and affiliation so we can recognize you.
Sure. Good morning. I want to thank all the panelists for sharing their stories. My name is Jamie Cipher. I live in Leadville, Colorado. We're a small rural mountain town, and we used to be in Lauren Boebert's district before redistricting, so just to set the stage there. I'm curious, especially to hear from Leslie, but all of the other panelists as well, like the dollars and cents argument in favor of basic income. I would love some nuggets to hear about just what is the case to make to our, fellow citizens on the right, because if it makes dollars and cents, then let's do it.
So the $1 billion a year minimum I get is a big number. And we don't actually have a comprehensive place where, the Great Smoky Mountain study showed that half of mental illness could be explained by poverty. But we don't have sort of a comprehensive, this is how much of addiction can be explained by poverty, this is how much deaths of despair. We know it's significant. I think conservatively a third, I think it's higher than that. So then we have numbers in lots of little places. I got a lot of my information from the National Institutes of Health. So for example, right before the pandemic, the National Institutes of Health estimated that mental illness cost the U.S. that $500 million every year is spent on mental illness. And that's in lost wages, disability, and direct expenditures. So if you consider that half of that, but we'll say conservatively a third, it could be explained by poverty, you knock off, a third of $500 million a year. Then a study just came out in they just reported on the data from 2017. They looked at literally a very small sliver of the cost of addiction. In one state, North Carolina, they looked at how much does addiction cost only in hospitalizations. It turns out 10% of all hospitalizations in 2017 were addiction related. And that was to the tune of $327 million. So if you knock off the percentage that could be explained by poverty in one state, we're talking big bucks. And then you multiply that, and that's just those two little slivers of the impacts of poverty. So I continue to touch base with academics to see if there's a way that we could come up with a more comprehensive read on that. But there's no way it's less than $1 billion a year in the US.
Thank you.
Let me just say something very briefly. So, first of all, there are multiple pathways through which positive economic effects will occur. Leslie's talked about the savings on services, on health services, but there are also likely to be savings in other services, criminal justice services. So poverty is a determinant not of all crime, but of certain crimes. There are likely to be savings in family violence services and so on and so forth. So that's one pathway. The other pathway is supporting employment and entrepreneurship. So we have evidence that basic income does that. We also have evidence, as my colleagues have said, that welfare punishes work. It taxes back. I mean, welfare recipients, when they work in Canada, if we consider both the benefits they lose and the taxes they pay on income, it's well above 70% in many cases, and that is real punishment for work. But the other thing I would argue is we can't just look at the idea of savings and benefits to the economy. We have to also make the argument that basic income produces some good things. It improves the health and development of children. It improves the health of adults. There are larger so-called spillover effects so that it makes our communities safer. And we have some evidence, not enough yet for all of this. We shouldn't just say we can justify basic income by what we say. We can also justify basic income for what it buys us. And finally, I think we have to continue to unashamedly make the argument that money isn't everything. We should do some things because it's the right thing to do, the ethical thing to do, not just the money-saving thing to do.
Yeah. And to your point around child development, betterment of child development with healthcare, I think another aspect of that is, and that we haven't been able to measure much within some of the short-term basic income pilots that we've seen, is that really long-term effect. Like, what's going to happen with those kids 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line? What's their earning potential? What are their mental health crises or lack of mental health crises going to look like because they had more stable childhoods?
Oh, can I?
Yes.
Okay, so obviously I'm still crushing hard on the Great Smoky Mountain study. One of the things that they found with the kids of families who received the benefit is that the kids scored higher on measures of resiliency, and there's another academic word I can't remember, but basically it is the best predictor we have of stable relationships and a stable work history. And they saw the most dramatic improvement with the kids who were most deficient in that area. So just having that, right.
Like experiential, exponential.
Right,
yeah.
right. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I think there's one more question from Josh.
Yeah. This might go long, so if you want to cut it off, it's fine. But there's something that's been sort of bugging me that's like just this, and it kind of fits in with like the conversation about narrative, and it has to do with this concept of resilience. That resilience is something that needs to be taught. Like we have to, even like at the highest levels of government, if we're not putting people through hardship, they're not going to be tough. They're not going to be, they're going to be soft. We're going to have this society of, whisk bags and snowflakes, right? And so like I'm raising an 8-year-old boy, and it's always in my head. There's this sort of voice of like, I need to toughen this kid up, or he's going to be just, he's not going to make it in the world. And so I'm just wondering, like, what your thoughts are about that, and like, is this something that we need to kind of attack in some way? Like, is it a concept we need, right?
Can I start?
Sure.
I agree 100% with what you're talking about. And what I'd say is there are several different ways of looking at resilience. So there's an atomistic, individualistic, kind of neoliberal way of looking at resilience as a characteristic of a person. And you're making kind of the target hardening argument that we have to humanely and slowly, gradually introduce children to hardship. There's another, and I would argue more realistic way of seeing resilience, and this is not based on independence, but based on interdependence. And this looks not only at the individual, but at the environment and the relationship between the two. And from that definition, we should be training children to be able to be interdependent, to be skilled and have the right attitudes to connect with other people.
We need to wrap up here. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Can I just say briefly, hardening somebody up is not resilience. They're actually more brittle. Resilience is about letting people face something hard with our backing and our love and our support. That is resilience. That's what we need to build in.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. We are going to wrap up and head on up for the next session.